Hello, today's November 2nd. My name is Dave Beran. I'm here with Baxter Hines and Carol Goforth. Just yesterday, the President's Working Group on Financial Stability, together with the OCC and the FDIC, put out a report in which they consulted with various third parties, BlockFi, Coinbase, Gemini, some think tanks, some folks in academia, and this was a report on stablecoins. Carol, what's your take on the report? Just initially reading it, and what do you think the recommendations? What do you think it points to as far as adoption and what's going to happen?
Thanks very much for a very difficult question. It is a long and dense report. I have read through it. The big point that is just sort of in your face is concern that stablecoins have gotten out of hand. They are posing systematic risks, either risk that individual global stablecoins might be too big to fail, or might cause a cascade effect. If one fails, the next might fail, potentially triggering the need for buyouts, which would be devastating to our financial system. And that there have been enough risks of systemic abuses that there is the vital, urgent need for additional regulation. That is in addition to the SEC, in addition to the CFTC, both of which are specifically called out as probably having authority over at least some of these assets, and specific urging of a number of legislative responses by Congress, including limiting the issuers of stablecoins to being essentially regulated financial institutions like banks, limiting any ability to issue these unless you are divorced from any large commercial entity, and other requirements about stability and what kind of assets you have to hold. So a very comprehensive, intensive regulatory set of recommendations. I think they're pretty clearly worried about things like the potential for a global stablecoin that they don't want to see, like the Facebook Libra proposal, now made as Diem proposal, and worried about things like the Tether, which wound up being sued in New York because they were not holding all of the assets that they represented that they were holding. So it is, it sounds an alarm. It recognizes the incredible growth of this industry, and the response really is intensely protective, I think, of the conventional banking and financial structure that we have had in place prior to crypto assets. So I certainly don't think this is good news for the crypto industry, notwithstanding the fact that there are some legitimate concerns here.
So on one hand, it does give sort of credence and credibility to the space, right? They're paying attention and taking notice.
You bet.
But it's pulling on the reins and saying, hey, easy, big fella. Pulling back to this conventional banking, and actually, I mean, if they're going to be regulated by the FDIC, to me, the folks that would be happy about this would be the larger banks that are actually getting into the space. Right?
I think that's probably true. Baxter, you think this is the way to read this material?
I think you're right, but before I go on, let me just put a little bit of emphasis and clarity on the importance of stablecoins in general. There's an old saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and I think that is especially true in the case of the blockchain, because the stablecoins, in essence, are the liquidity provider or the liquidity mechanism by which you trade Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the other different cryptocurrencies. And if there is some kind of question mark that is put on these stable coins, it's going to affect the tradability of this market, and not only the ability but the cost of trading in these markets, cost in terms of additional time, cost in terms of additional just fees in general. And so If you look at the history of stablecoins and the growth, it's been astronomical. It's just exponentially rising year after year. And I don't know what the growth rate is, but when I first started dealing with them in 2019, there was probably less than $1 billion worth of stablecoins. Now you're easily breaking 100 billion. And it just continues to go higher and higher as time marches on. And in fact, there have been studies by, I believe it was Cambridge University, that showed there is a correlation between when there's more money put into stablecoins, the prices of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies go higher. That makes sense. It's just like in the stock market today, where if the Fed continues to put out more money or the ECB continues to put out more money into the system, stock prices go higher. Same thing, more stablecoins, higher crypto prices. And so when you have these pieces of legislation that are put into place, that could inhibit that growth rate and cause issues for just the overall pricing for crypto, in my opinion. I think the other thing that is important to mention is that these stable coins are typically run by smaller, in the grand scheme of things, entities within the financial system. And as you start hearing about JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or other big banks and big financial companies around the world looking to get into the stablecoin market, I think it's important that the legislation gets ironed out, and it gets ironed out before even more money starts getting into these new vehicles for transferring wealth globally. And so I think the timing is right. Like everything in crypto, the regulation can tend to cause short-term hiccups, but I think it's a good thing in the long run. It's sort of a healthy necessity that we have to go through. There's going to be some uncertainty as we iron out these situations.
I like the idea of some regulation. I certainly have been very unhappy with the history of Tether in particular, and its unwillingness to candidly explain exactly how is Tether being backed, and with Tether being the most highly traded of the stable coins and with the highest market value at the current time, it is a legitimate point of concern. I think I'm more worried than you are that this strikes a balance that is too heavy-handed for this situation. It is regulating to take care of the worst of the problems, almost assuming that all of the players are at the outskirts of legitimacy, rather than saying we have a very important development. We have people who are really trying very hard to be compliant, and we have a few outliers that we need to take care of. This set of recommendations strikes me as coming down too hard on an industry likely to stifle competition, innovation, drive up prices for the business, not prices of the value of the crypto assets themselves, actually diminish the value of crypto assets. And I don't think that's a particularly positive development, notwithstanding legitimate concerns in the space.
Well, the one thing I would say, though, about that is Tether still is the juggernaut. Let's say it's 60, 70% of all stable coins are in that one vehicle, Tether. And so I agree with you that the transparency is just not there. I wrote about that in my book. That continues to be an issue. And the whole reason we have banking regulations is to make sure that the people who are in control of these assets, other people's money, that they're not using them for their own benefit, and that they are taking on undue risks that the consumer's not either aware of or would not expect to have. And so if Tether is abusing it and they're the biggest player in the game, I do see a big need for it. Like you said, though, you can be too heavy-handed. And how do you deal with that problem in a way that doesn't cause too many ripples in the water? I don't have the right answer for.
I will say, yeah, I'll be watching too. I will say that one of the positive things is this is a recommendation for congressional action. We have seen before the crypto industry being willing to expend time, energy, and funds to educate legislators, and it is entirely possible that by the time we actually see a piece of legislation that it might choose to address the biggest problems rather than come down like a hammer.
Right, based on this report, what it sounds like is that the only entities that would be able to issue, let's assuming that the report, all the recommendations are enacted, are taken in consideration, and that's what happens. The only entities that could issue stablecoins would be those entities that can afford all the risk management, that can afford all of the collateralization, right? Having all of this collateral backing up stablecoins, can afford all these processes in place for compliance, and I mean it would be large banks. I mean that is it.
The very first of the recommendations, as summarized in the executive summary part of the report, says to address risks to stablecoin users and guard against stablecoin runs, legislation should require stablecoin issuers to be insured depository institutions subject to appropriate supervision and regulation at the depository institution and the holding company level. So I think you're spot on.
And
so let me ask you this. Tether, with its history, started in the Bahamas. I don't know where it's based now, but I know they did a lot of stuff with, and are continuing to do a lot of stuff with Taiwan. How does it fall? How does the U.S. or how does this apply to them? Because if, again, they're still the juggernaut, does the U.S. kind of reach out and say, hey, you're dealing with U.S. people, we're going to come after you? Or what do you see as the solution to that, or the actions by the actors in Washington on this issue?
We have had no trouble saying that our laws apply to you if you do business with U.S. residents. I will note that part of the report also says that with regard to the anti-money laundering and the financial risks and illicit behavior that is also a concern in this space, the U.S. will continue to work with the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international agency that has helped develop anti-money laundering, know your customer, counter-terrorist funding initiatives and standards. So the report does recognize the need for increased and continuing international cooperation, but for the things that are focused on U.S. requirements like being an insured depository institution, you're going to do business with U.S. folks, you comply with U.S. law.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll be back next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.